when you look inward that you grow. Introspect 2022 brings to a diverse lineup of events, starting with this highly awaited speaker session on Russia-Ukraine conflict with Professor Sukh Muni. We will have the Enigma, an online treasure hunt, followed by Policy Hackathon, which you will be glad to know is a brainchild of Political Science Association. We will then take you to the galaxy of various events like Amna Samna, Nazariya, Deja Vu, Chithi, Recreate, and much more to showcase the skills, knowledge, and abilities. You almost heard the saying, when the going gets tough, the tough gets going. I feel really proud to say that the Political Science Student Association stands true to this. Putting together an online fest is a challenging as an offline one. But when you have a group of young minds at work who don't let themselves to be hindered by these difficult times, well, the going gets easy. Thus, I would like to thank the council for their unwavering dedication and hard work, not only for this fest, but for the entire academic year. I would also like to thank our professors for their constant support and valuable inputs, which has made this fest possible. On this note, I, Shivam Kumar, the President of Political Science Department, Sri Venkateshwara College, declares Introspect 2022 open. Thank you, and over to Shreya.
Thank you, Shivam. Now, I would like to call upon the head of Political Science Department, Dr. Jita Mishra ma'am, to kindly address the gathering.
Respected Principal C. Sheila Reddy, esteemed Chief Guest Professor S.D. Muni, my fellow colleagues and dear students. On behalf of the Department of Political Science, Sri Venkateshwara College, I welcome you to Introspect 2022. This mixes entertainment with learning. The political session has organized some intellectually stimulating competitions like policy hackathon, workshop on the skill of academic writing and publication, the Enigma treasure hunt, quiz, and so on. There is also a webinar on Russia-Ukraine conflict, the changing geopolitics by Professor S.D. Muni. Introspect 2022 will be held for 3 days on 13th, 14th, and 15th April 2022. I hope you find this events interesting and enjoy every moment of it. As you know, Professor S.D. Muni has held the prestigious Appadurai Chair of International Politics and Area Studies in Jawaharlal University, where he was conferred Professor Emeritus in 2014. He also received the Lifetime Achievement Award from Sri Venkateshwara University, Tirupati, Andhra Pradesh. I thank you, sir, for being here and taking some time off from your busy schedule for us students. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We feel privileged to have your supervision and backing with us at all times. Now, may I invite Anushka, the editor-in-chief of our magazine Yantra, to announce about the launch of the second edition of our very own magazine. The students of our department have done a very creative job in compiling the magazine together.
Hello everyone, I'm Anushka Verma, the editor-in-chief of the second edition of our department magazine Loktantra. Our theme for this edition originated from our belief that freedom of expression is an essential tool that facilitates democracy, the namesake of our magazine. Therefore, we have attempted to be inclusive in giving a stage for people to voice their views, no matter how diverse they are. For starters, this magazine doesn't contain exquisite pieces from experts, but the purely unapologetic opinions of the students of our department, thus justifying its title. The magazine team has tried to bring together a mosaic of such thoughts, vision, and experiences of the members of the department through various mediums like essays, poetry, etc. The second edition has covered various aspects of Indian politics and society, like climate change, casteism, sports infrastructure, etc. And it has also given space to affairs of the global order, like emergence of the new Cold War between US and China, the neo-colonialism in Puerto Rico, and so on. The new edition is the student's review of a work of literature and art, as these elements are often a reflection of any social or political culture. The magazine also gives a glimpse. It also gives a glimpse that of the various events that our department has organized in the past year, ranging from elections of the student union to educational webinars and lectures by distinguished personalities. Hope that the magazine serves the ever-ranging palette of the reader and makes it worth thumbing every page of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Anushka. Over the years, it has been a tradition to inaugurate Introspect with a speaker on the issue of extreme relevance, Ukraine conflict, the changing geopolitics. I find immense pleasure in introducing our esteemed speaker, Professor S.D. Muni Sir, who has been a Professor Emeritus at the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University of Executive Council of Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, New Delhi. For nearly 40 years, he taught, conducted, and supervised research in international relations, Asian studies at JNU, National University of Singapore, Banaras Hindu University, and University of Rajasthan. Professor Envoy to the Southeast Asian countries of the United Nations Security Council and represented India's Ministry of External Affairs at the 50th anniversary celebration of Paris Conference. He also served as India's ambassador to Laos People's Democratic Republic. Professor Muni was nominated to the first ever National Security Advisory Board of India during 1990-1991. He was the founding executive member of the Regional Center of Strategic Studies, Colombo, Sri Lanka. In 2005, he was bestowed with the Sri Lanka Ratna Award, Sri Lanka's highest national honor for a foreign national. The Institute of National Security Studies Sri Lanka Colombo offered him an affiliation as Honorary Distinguished Fellow in 2016. Sir, we are truly honored to have you with us today. May I now invite you to throw some light on today's topic.
Thank you, Shreyaji. I'm sorry I couldn't get all you were saying because your volume was little on the lower side. But thanks a lot for asking me to interact with you. It's a great pleasure. In fact, to be in the company of young people like this keeps us going, fortunately, and gives us new ideas, new enthusiasm to talk about. In my introduction, in your poster also, you have written me Executive Council member of IDSA, which I was until recently. I have completed my terms, and I'm no longer there. But I just wanted to correct you. The subject you have chosen is really contemporary and I would say very complex. It has several dimensions. It may not be possible for me to go into the details of all these dimensions, and we don't have much of the time either at our disposal to do that. So what I do is to flag some of the important aspects of the conflict as I see them, and then you grill me. You ask and probably will other dimensions of the conflict. To begin with, we must have the Ukraine in mind. I hope all of you have seen a map of Ukraine. I'm not very technologically savvy, but let me see if I can show it to you on the screen. Otherwise, I'll flash the paper like that, just to keep it in your mind what is the country we are talking about. Now, Oh, you have disabled the participant screen sharing, so I can't do that. Anyway, what I see is you should keep this in mind. The couple of things about this map is that the country is divided in east and west, with a river flowing inside, in between, where Kiev, the capital, is located. Now, Ukraine is a divisive country. Crimea is on the south. These are the southeast areas which are very, very important. We will see later. I'm sorry, because the map is coming in rivers and you can't read these names. But just keep it in mind: east and west, east, south, and north, west. These are the areas. Now, this country is divided ethnically in terms of culture, and their habits, primarily between the Russians and the non-Russians, which are also Jews, Catholics, various other people. And these divisions are historic. It has a long history, more than 1,000 years of history for the Ukraine, and we cannot go into it. Economically, it is divided in east and west, in the sense that the eastern areas are very industrial, those which are bordering with Russia, and western areas are largely agricultural, and they are fairly prosperous, but they have huge trade relationship with various other countries. We have been depending upon Ukraine for a very long time for spare parts of many of the Russian weapon systems, which are being produced there. We have also been trading with them in foodstuffs and other items. But this is the area, and various aspects to understand. We must keep it in mind that it's a divided country. It had different context, but in the war, the way it has come up is very significant in terms of the way they have been fighting. Now, after keeping this in mind, what are the Russian objectives broadly? And I think broadly, there are 3-4 things we must here again understand. Russia has always been trying to get integrated with Europe economically and technologically. And this is soon after the Second World War. You will notice, you must have studied in your various classes, during the Second World War, the Russians were with the democratic progressive Europe, with the US, with England, with France, not with Germany and Italy, which are called fascist at that time. But since then, it has always wanted to remain integrated in a part of the European security system. But Europe has difficulties, and Americans had difficulties accepting Russia as a part of Europe, primarily because Russia is a huge country, is a big power, and would dominate the Europe. It would not really let Europe wherever it is. Then they found that economically Russia may be a burden on Europe, because Europe is more prosperous than Russia is. And then there are huge civilizational and cultural differences, above all the differences of ideology in terms of communism and the free liberal world which we have in Europe. So they never wanted this kind of integration, but all along the deep desire, mostly unexplained, unasserted, is that Russia wants from its side to be greater integrity in European economy. That did not happen. Russia has been very opposed to the expansion of NATO towards the east. NATO, as you think, was a military alliance brought into being largely more assertively after the Second World War, and largely to feed into the Cold War in terms of containing Russia and not allowing it. And expansion on the east really means that it will get closer to Russia. Now, Russia, after disintegration from the Soviet Union as it was, lost many of the Eastern European countries, they became independent, and NATO invited them, NATO made them members. In fact, after the Second World War and after the end of the Cold War, 14 new countries have joined NATO. Now, every time, repeatedly, talk to Americans, Europeans, and told them, since the Cold War has ended, Russia has shrunk in itself. There is no need for NATO to expand. And this is a repeated assurance, both from the Americans and the Europeans, that we would not expand. But this assurance has never been fulfilled, or what you call promises being implemented. And this expansion gives a sense of insecurity to Russia. And that's where it wanted to stop it. Thirdly, Russia had deep geostrategic stakes in Ukraine because Ukraine gives them additional access to sea. Russia, as you can see, look into the map, has very limited access to sea. And almost 6 months for a year, some of its sea fronts are frozen, and it cannot have trade with it. So it wants that trade to continue for the whole year, and therefore warm water access is absolutely essential strategically for Russia. Now, Ukraine gives them a bit of, and that's why in 2014, when they took over Crimea, which I showed you the map, which is in the south of Ukraine, was largely to facilitate that kind of access, because there the ports are open for another 6 months. Now they want to link the eastern part of Ukraine with the southern part, so that there is a contiguity in their land routes and in their sea routes, and they can make utilization. In addition to that, this is an area which is dominated by the Russian-speaking people culturally, and they have claimed that these people are discriminated in Ukraine, particularly by the Nazi-dominated or Jews-dominated or Catholics-dominated people, and they want to protect them. Now, recently, there are two small provinces in the east which will come in a short while, which have rebelled against Ukrainian authorities. They are largely Russian speaking, and they have sought assistance from Russia. But the objective which the Russians are declaring is clear. They say, we want to protect these Russian speaking people culturally, which are close to us, and a great deal of Russian civilization sprang from and get support out of that. So these were some of the broad objectives which have always been talked about. They have had several agreements with Europe and America for non-expansion of NATO, and they have many times had agreements also for the protection of the Russian people, but they found that these were not really being implemented. Now, what triggered the war? Because this is something which has been continuing for a long time. What triggered the war is that the last agreement of December 2021 regarding the expansion of NATO, as I said, and earlier there were two agreements of Minsk for 2014 and 2015, under which the expansion of NATO towards the east should be stopped. Along with the United States of America, had said that Georgia and Ukraine may be admitted into NATO. After that came the Minsk agreement, in which Russia has again been saying that you should not take it, because what happens is that if Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, then from the Ukraine border, Moscow is hardly 300 kilometers. And if they deploy weapon systems there in Ukraine, then without even flying into Russia, the NATO would be able to send missiles hitting Moscow and others. So the Russians find this as an existential threat to them in the expansion of NATO towards the east in general, but certainly Ukraine being taken as a part of NATO. Now, these agreements have not been implemented despite the best efforts. And as I said, the latest agreement, which has not been accepted, was of December 2021. And then Russia started moving in its troops from January, February, and February, they, of course, late February, they started their attack. So the idea was that wanted to pose a challenge to NATO, which means Europe and United States of America, that this expansion is not acceptable to them. Then on the east, there are two areas, Donetsk and Lugansk. And these are as I said, these are Russian-dominated areas. Russians had rebelled. They had established their own so-called independent control of these areas and asked Russia to support them against the Ukrainian, because Ukrainian wanted not to accept that kind of an independence. And Russia had to move in to support these areas. So these were the immediate triggers for the war. Now the war has gone on very long, as you know, there is a huge stalemate in the conflict. And in this stalemate, the Russians have suffered very deeply, and Ukrainian have also suffered. Ukraine, as a country, is totally destroyed. Though the military assessment is that Russia had not really put in all its military might. It had not attacked the urban centers except some areas which they wanted to Kharkiv on the northeastern side, and these Donbass areas where these two independent states are there. So the war has not proceeded according to the Russian calculations. There is no doubt about it. And Russians are in a real serious trouble. Now, why it has happened? Because I think Russia had a miscalculation that divided and weak Ukraine will fall very soon, that the regime is very poor. They did not realize the nationalist resistance which could emerge out of it. Let us think back. I think Russians should have, that nationalism has emerged in the last 3-4 decades as a very powerful force in all the countries, big and small. I mean, even superpowers like America are talking about Americans first. And we in India are also talking. The Chinese nationalism has grown like anything else. And all smaller countries have had a very strong nationalist feeling. This is where the globalization has been weakened. Now, the Russians they underestimated, or they probably did not take into account the kind of resistance which the Ukrainians, they thought they would just have a walkover by the show of force, which did not take place. They also knew that Europe would be divided, because France and Germany have always had a soft relationship and larger economic dependence on Russia. And they thought that they would all not follow the US directions or the NATO directions really to resist Russia. But this again proved to be incorrect. NATO has not come into the war, largely because they know that NATO's coming into the war would lead to a very serious escalation of the conflict, in which Russia may use nuclear weapons. And during the war, Russia has been asking that if there is any existential threat to them, they will use nuclear weapons. And this is, no country is prepared for that kind of a war. So they have cautioned, the NATO has cautioned itself that we will not directly, America has also cautioned them, the NATO directly would not indulge into this conflict. But they have become united in supporting Ukraine in putting up resistance to Russia, that they would not succumb to Russia and would not allow Russia to have its own geopolitical, geostrategic objectives in Ukraine. They, in fact, want to see Russia bogged down in Ukraine as it got bogged down in Afghanistan. And then probably depleted sources. Again, we can recall that Afghan involvement of Russia, the former Soviet Union, actually led to the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the depletion. And later on, even there came Gorbachev and Yeltsin, even a stream of democracy in Russia, in terms of, and many of the American authors, you must have read them, the end of history had come for them, that ideological conflict has ceased to exist. And this is the kind of scenario which Europe and America would like to be repeated for Russia in Ukraine. So they would want Russia to walk down into the conflict, but they would not directly confront Russia in order to avoid any major global conflict. Now, Russia has also been very cautious in a sense that they have said these are the special operations. This is not a war on Ukraine. It is not an all-out Ukraine war. And I've seen some of the Pentagon, American Defense Department assessments in which media reports have come and said that Russians have not put in more than 10% of their total strength. Even then we saw Kyiv, for instance, the fact that some of the East European prime ministers and now even the British prime minister has been able to travel by train to Kyiv shows that Kyiv is not under great threat. I mean, if the city is under war, it would be impossible for the trains to travel normally and people to get and have their business, and the British Prime Minister even had inspections all around. So the Russian claim is, Russian assessment is that it is a special operation in which what they have said is to destroy the military capacities of Ukraine, particularly the airports. They had a complete control over the airspace on Ukraine. You could see, I mean, we saw television shots and satellite shots for almost 4-5 days of miles, kilometers long, lineup of the Russian tanks. Now, if anybody had a control over the air, the tanks could have been destroyed. The tanks have been destroyed. Some of them have been destroyed, largely because of the land war by Stinger missiles and all that, which have been supplied to Ukraine by Europe. So they controlled the airspace, but there was not an all-out attack on Ukraine. It was a selective attack. Some of the cities are important, like Mariupol, and there the attack has been, even Kharkiv has been very badly attacked. But this is where the limitations of the war remain. And that's why, to some extent, it has also facilitated the resistance from Ukraine. Then further, if you go down, there is obviously a failure of a strategy that even with these special operations, the Russians have not been able to control Ukraine. And there are reports of, I think, 3 to 4 of the very senior Russian generals have died, almost 12 to 15,000. I would caution you not to accept the media figures, but media figures are part of the propaganda war, both from Russian and also from the European NATO side. So we must be very careful in not accepting these figures, but very high figures are being quoted for the which the Russians have suffered. I have a long list. If you have details, we can go into that. How many tanks they have lost, how many helicopters they have lost. But they have lost their people, they have lost their major general. And there were problems even of the command and control in terms of many of the Russian soldiers not even accepting. So there is a serious problems of failure in carrying out the war. And what therefore, now we see is the second phase. It is the Ukraine-Russia war 2.0 that in the last, I think, few weeks we have entered into. The first phase of the war is over. The Russians have withdrawn from Kiev and Sumy and some of the other areas. They might continue to attack, and there is a what you call regrouping or re-strategizing of the war, in which they have said very clearly that Donab region, which is the eastern southern region, the Russians would like to control, and they would want denatofication. That is an objective which continues to be there, but it would be very selected and I guess very intense war. If you want to have a glimpse of details, go to the yesterday's Putin's speech, in which he has said that war has not come to an end. He said the talks which were going on between Ukraine and Russia would have reached the dead end, that the Ukrainians have changed its goalposts. Ukraine at one stage had agreed that it is prepared to sign, that it would remain neutral, it would never join the NATO, but now it has put up different conditions which are not acceptable to Russia. Therefore, no peace talks are going on at the moment, and Russia would continue the war and try to have its own objective. See, this is necessary also for Putin, because Putin had built up an image of a very strong leader in Russia. And now, since he had taken the initiative, he cannot simply walk back because that would completely erode his political support, which is already going down. There are many Russians which are also protesting against Putin's war. Very strong measures are being taken to suppress the kind of dissent which is there against the war in Russia. And there are problems which the Putin will face politically if he does not achieve his stated goals. So what he is doing is that he has redefined the goals of the arms, which are far more limited from what they are. And I think in the coming days, we will see very intense conflict in these areas, particularly southern and eastern part of Ukraine. We will see a very serious conflict going on. So this is where we stand today in terms of war in Russia is concerned. Now, one question which comes to our mind is, where does India stand today? I mean, there are various, as I said, various aspects where China stands, where whole of Indo-Pacific countries stand. I'm afraid because of the time limitations, I don't want to go, because I want to have interaction with you. The purpose was really to have more of a question answer. But where India stands. Now, India has consistently accepted, without publicly acknowledging, that Russia's concern regarding the expansion of the eastward of NATO are genuine. Firstly, they believe. Secondly, there are a lot of arguments about human rights and various other things which are not cutting much ice with the Indian decision makers, largely because they are coming out from the US, and US is exercising pressure on various other countries, including on India, not to have more engagement with Russia, isolate Russia, and this is something which India has. There is a history of this. We cannot go into the details of that history, but Russia, earlier Soviet Union, and India have had a very, very close relationship, particularly during the Cold War, when India was experiencing a lot of pressure and difficulties. It was Russia which stood in terms of veto. Either it is a question of Kashmir, or it was a question of liberation of Bangladesh on some of these critical issues. And almost 60 to 65 to 70% of India's defense dependence is on Russian weapons and weapon systems and spare parts and whatnot. And all said and done, India has found Russia as a dependable ally, despite the fact now that Russia has started opening up relations with one of India's serious adversary, Pakistan, and Russia is heavily dependent upon another adversary called China. Despite this fact, the Indo-Russian relationship in defense sector has continued. There is not much trade. Trade is hardly 8 billion, but this defense relationship cannot be ignored. So there are two issues before Indian decision makers. One, a continued dependence upon Russia and Russia's dependability. There are issues there in terms of values and prices of the new weapon systems. Russia has inflated them. Sometimes the deliveries have been delayed. Repairs of aircraft carriers, etc., has been delayed. All that apart, by and large, Russia has remained a dependable ally of India. And India cannot ignore the defense and security aspect very clearly. Secondly, Russia is now emerging also as an energy supplier. And lot of energy agreements between India and Russia have been concluded. And we look forward to continuing energy support from Russia. So what India has done is to take cognizance of the fact that Russia's attack on Ukraine was not called for. Therefore, India has used the terms like sovereignty and territorial integrity should not be violated for any country. And that is a message to Russia, which Prime Minister Modi has spoken to Putin, and Prime Minister Modi has also spoken to Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. And we have made it very clear that this aggression in itself is not endorsable. We cannot accept it. But at the same time, India also finds that the severe economic sanctions which have been inflicted upon Russia are almost equal to an economic war in which Russian economy is being crippled. And not only Russian economy is being crippled, but all the value chains, supply chains all over the world are being adversely affected. And this is something which should be undone, which should be stopped. And this is what India has been saying again, that sanctions would not deliver. India itself has been a victim of sanctions in 1998 when we exploded our nuclear device. The US imposed those sanctions upon us. But this is one reason that sanctions are not acceptable, not approved by. Now, caught in this dilemma of dependence upon Russia on the one hand, and non-acceptance of the kind of sanctions and the kind of judgment, value judgments, which the West is imposing and West is talking about, India neutral. Almost 11 votes which were there, India has remained neutral on that. Now, the last vote, which was on the expulsion of Russia from the Human Rights Council, if you see the world, how the world is divided and polarized on it is, there were 58 votes which were abstention votes. And I think 24 votes were there in favor of Russia and 92 votes were there against Russia. If you add up 58 plus 28, which did not want Russia to be expelled, it almost comes to 82. Now 82 and 92 is a very close. So the world is divided on the question of expulsion, marginalization, isolation of Russia, which is not fair. India has other concerns that if Russia is isolated, then its dependence on China will increase. And if its dependence on China increases, this is no good for us. We don't want that to happen. In fact, the more Russia is accommodated in Europe, the more Russia's dependence on China will decrease. And that is a kind of a development which India is looking forward to. So therefore, the issues like NATO's expansion, Russia's sanctions on Russia, the question of human rights issues and exclusion is pushing Russia into the Chinese lap, raising its dependence on China. I think all these factors are strategically not acceptable so far as India is concerned. And that's why we have taken a neutral position. The latest of this debate took place yesterday and day before on the 2+2 meeting which India and US had. And you see the differences if you see the joint statement which has come out of the Indo-US 2+2 meeting on Ukraine issue. It is very clear that the American position is very different from the Indian position. India has not completely followed. What India is insisting on, that there should be diplomatic engagement between Russia and Ukraine. India has even argued for the Russian president and the Ukrainian president to sit down and talk to each other and bring about peace through negotiations and talks. Therefore, India is against the war. India is for the peace, for negotiated peace, mediate between the two countries. But India is not for either extension of NATO towards the east or expulsion of US of Russia from international organizations and international bodies or economic crippling of Russia. This is where the Indian position stands. And I think this is a position which is very much equal to what our non-aligned position was earlier. I have a feeling this position will continue, though this is a position which has come under severe debate and serious discussion, both within India and outside the world. I may add one thing more, that one of the concerns of the Americans is that the Russian expansion argument is not working in the Indo-Pacific region. And in Indo-Pacific region, China's emergence or China's assertion is a far more powerful factor. Many of the Indo-Pacific countries have not voted with the US in terms of Russian expulsion, and they don't approve of the NATO's expansion or NATO's strengthening of further. Including in the Quad, India has made it very, very clear. Now, US wants India to play a major role in Indo-Pacific in bringing about opinion in favor of US position against Russia, because China is a major threat to India. And China, as we know in Ladakh, is already militarily asserting itself against India. As you would recall, that US has repeatedly said that if you have a conflict with China, Russia would not come to your assistance. We will come to your assistance. Therefore, you distance yourself from Russia. There are many in India who are also talking about it. I think India must maintain its balanced and distant relationship, whereby it asserts its neutrality in this kind of a position. If the war comes, war is imposed by China, India will deal with it. India is having equations with various other countries, including Israel and America. We are buying weapons, we are paying for them, but it should not lead to India compromising its traditional position of independence, which in the long run and in the short and immediate run is no good for us. Russia has so far proved to be very dependable. They have given S-400 missile deterrent systems to the Chinese. They have given the same system to us. So to say that they will favor China more against us is not a valid argument. So these are some of the reasons we should keep it in mind, when we are confronted with these arguments that if China launches a war, in terms of Chinese hostility, we must go and get much strategically closer to the Western countries, US in particular, and distance ourselves from Russia. Getting closer to the US is right. Getting distance from Russia is not right. That is the kind of a position which India has taken, and therefore we are maintaining this kind of a neutrality. But as the war continues more intensely, there would be more pressure on India. And I think we will have to walk the tightrope as we have walked so far in broad Indian national interest rather than in terms of ideological positions like the British should unite and get against. We have huge engagement even with China. China is one of the largest trading partner of India even today with all this conflict which is going on. So I think we need to take a very balanced view and very sober view of the kind of a situation which is there. And therefore I support the position which Government of India has taken so far. I think even on energy, the Americans are saying that you should reduce your import from energy. I think yesterday Dr. Jaishankar made a very crisp comment, and rightly so, that we are importing energy which is so little as compared to what the European countries are importing energy from Russia. He said our imports are for almost half a day, and compare it with the Russian with the European imports of energy, which is for almost for a equivalent the month of our requirement. We are only having a half a day requirement from Russia. So these are the arguments, and I think such arguments will continue. Such pressure will continue. You saw the pressure also in terms of human rights violations in India, India's approach to religious minorities and all that, which in 2+2 discussions, the Russian, the American State Secretary of State openly and publicly said that. So we must be prepared for these pressures, and we have to do a tightrope walking very carefully, very cautiously, but we should not abandon the balanced position which we have taken. All that we can do again is that we must somehow put in our efforts. I think talk to Putin also, talk to Russia as intensely as possible, talk to Russia, Ukraine, provide them humanitarian assistance, which we are providing, and see that somehow the war is closed and somehow a diplomatic and negotiated settlement of this conflict is brought about. I think I'll stop here. We still have about the time which was given to me, 15 to 20 minutes for questions. And I would want, if you have some questions, please put them forward.
Thank you so much, sir, for giving this event a wondrous start with your words. Indeed, we are very fortunate to have you with us.
Very, please loud. You can't see that. Your volume has to be louder.
Thank you so much, sir, for giving this event a wondrous start with your words. We are very fortunate to have you with us today. Now, let's move on to the interactive question and answer session. It would not be possible to answer all the questions by our audience due to the paucity of time, so our team has already selected the best ones. May I now invite sir to answer these questions. So the first question is, over the past decade, many pundits and commentators have argued that globally speaking, war is on the decline. How would you analyze this statement in respect to Russia? Over the past decade, many pundits and commentators have argued that globally speaking, war is on the decline. How would you analyze this statement in respect to Russia?
Well, I think war is on the full-scale wars are on the decline, but small conflicts have always gone on. Even Ukraine, we witnessed the conflict in Ladakh, which the Chinese literally militarily imposed upon us. There are border conflicts, small skirmishes. The Chinese even threatened the Japanese. But on the whole, the bigger wars are on the decline because there is a greater awareness amongst the people that they can't afford the consequences of such big conflicts. So Ukraine, in a way, breaks this trend more seriously because the Ukraine conflict is a typical conflict of a major power. But before that, as you see, we saw the Iraq war, we saw Afghanistan conflict going on, we saw problems in Syria, we saw problems in Libya. We have seen such conflicts emerging from time to time in one form or the other. But major wars have been avoided. And even now we hope that Ukraine does not lead us to a major conflict.
Thank you, sir, for answering that question. So the second question is, has the Russian invasion of Ukraine exposed the weakness of the international order and especially United Nations?
Well, United Nations, United Nations has always been paralyzed in terms of conflicts like this. I mean, sometimes I ask that what are the conflicts which United Nations Security Council has intervened and resolved? Kashmir, you can start from Kashmir, we can see Bangladesh, we can see European conflicts, we can see Middle East conflicts, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you can see this Vietnam-Cambodia conflict which came. Nowhere United Nations has been able to successfully intervene into conflicts. We have a UN security force, peacekeeping force. We send even our troops there. So in Africa, etc., yes, they go and mediate somewhere. But the conflicts have not been resolved. Many of the internal insurgencies, big insurgencies, like the conflict in Sri Lanka, the conflict in Nepal, which we saw it, nowhere the United Nations could really intervene. The United Nations Security Council has been paralyzed because of veto. And we have been asking for restructuring that. Sometimes general body is brought about it. I told you just now that even in Russia's conflict in Ukraine, it's almost equally divided in terms of Russia's expulsion. And that is General Assembly. The vote was taken in General Assembly. This is where we find. UN Security Council has not succeeded, which is the principal body of resolving conflicts in the world. And it is unfortunate but true that United Nations continues to be still a post-Second World War institution when it comes to the conflict resolution. They have not been able to rise above that. I mean, nowhere anything, China is doing whatever it wants to do in Xinjiang and Tibet. Nobody can stop them. Not a word being raised in World Forum against China for human rights violations. The American violations of human rights, nothing was raised anywhere else. So UN has many advantages in education, in health, in cultural expansion, in terms of children. It has brought voices of many small countries on the global forum. It has many advantages. I'm not undermining that. But when it comes to conflict resolution, I see very little success being achieved by the United Nations.
Thank you, sir, for answering that question. So the third question is, what other measures could Russia have taken to make Ukraine pay heed to their geopolitical interest instead of full-scale invasion?
No, it has revised. I told you it has revised its objectives. Now, earlier it was, they said special operations in Ukraine, in which they attacked Kyiv. They also attacked Lviv. which is the westernmost city and areas. Now we expect that Russia would be limited in its operations in terms of eastern and southern parts of Ukraine. So let us hope that, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed. The war can be far more intense in these areas. Though we hope that the Russians would take care of the human rights, in the sense, provide passages for those who want to go. And, even now we have 5 million refugees which have come out of Ukraine so far. And in many cases, the Russians have provided ceasefire and said, okay, take these people out. You will go about it. There are allegations of chemical weapons being used. And Russians have denied it repeatedly. But on chemical weapons, we must be very clear that almost more than 24 laboratories in Ukraine are funded by the US, and they are under US control, where viruses and pathogens are being developed. Now, I hope that by making this argument that Russia is using nuclear weapons, maybe the West would want to impose others of sanctions on Russia by so-called, we don't have the evidence. I don't have the evidence. You don't have the evidence. India does not have the evidence as to exactly what is happening on the ground there. And we recall the Iraq war. The Americans said the Iraqis are developing nuclear weapons and therefore we are going and controlling them. And nothing like that came out later on there. So we should be very cautious in accepting the propaganda which is coming from the other side. But the situation can be serious, whether chemical weapons are used or not used. But situation can be serious because Putin has to survive politically, and in order to survive politically within Russia, he must demonstrate that Russia's objectives have been achieved.
Thank you, sir, for answering that question. Now, the fourth question that we have is, even after Russia invaded Ukraine, Ukraine urged NATO to make it a member. Is NATO genuinely interested
Please go slowly. Your this audio system, there is no problem in others speaking. I can hear them. I find, please go slowly and loud, a little bit now.
Okay, so even after Russia invaded Ukraine,
Yes,
Ukraine urged NATO to make it a member. Is NATO genuinely interested in making Ukraine? If not, then the whole feud has been for no reason.
No, because Europe is also hesitant. They don't want to take Ukraine. No, it will have very serious consequences. But in one of the European meetings, as I said, in 2008, they had said that Georgia and Ukraine will be made members. They have not been made members, firstly. Secondly, despite denying that Europe would not expand towards the east, Europe has expanded towards the east. And they have taken 14 members. That's why the Russian fears, to some extent, are need to be taken into account.
Thank you, sir, for answering that question. Now, the fifth question that we have is, according to a study published recently, which states that Russia has almost recovered all the losses it faced due to sanctions, then to what extent those sanctions were effective if they were unable to force Russia to withdraw their troops from Ukraine and stop the war?
Look, my personal view is that the sanctions have never delivered. We were put under sanctions. Iran was put under sanctions. So many other countries are put under sanctions. And sanctions have never delivered the political and strategic objectives which the US had in mind. So the sanctions which they have put on individually, like Putin, his family, some of the big oligarchs who are supporting Putin, they have put personal sanctions on them. They have seized their money. I think to some extent the Europe has been very selective. Like the swift sanctions on the banks have not been put on the oil which is being imported by the European countries from Russia. So without without disturbing their own normal channels of trade and engagement, they have put sanctions, and Russia said, and so far it says that yes, we can manage these sanctions. And sanctions cannot force a determined country, any determined country. As I said, we have gone through the sanctions. So yes, it will affect economically to Russia. I mean, there are problems of items now. There are questions. Russia is talking to us to have the oil deal in rupee ruble transactions rather than avoid. We are trying to avoid it through dollars. So there would be problems. There are inconveniences. There are difficulties. There are pressures being created. But once you are determined, sanctions cannot deliver you strategic objectives.
Thank you so much, sir, for answering all the questions. So I have a lot to take away from this session. Now, I would like to invite Aditi, our event head, to give official vote of thanks.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar and making it a success. Firstly, on behalf of the entire Political Science Department of Sri Venkateshwara College, including the association members, faculty, as well as students, I would like to extend my gratitude to Professor S.D. Muni, our speaker for the day, for gracing us with his presence and delivering an insightful lecture and providing their perspective on the ongoing conflict. I would like to thank our respected principal ma'am, Dr. C. Sheila Reddy, for giving us this wonderful opportunity for organizing this event. Also, a special thanks to our faculty members for guiding and supporting us throughout the event and its preparation. Finally, I'd like to thank our audience members for being so active and sending across a lot of inquisitive questions. Thank you so much for being so cooperative and participating in the event in huge numbers. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining this session. Day ahead.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Can I leave now?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Can I leave now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you.